place, you're seeing more and more confirmation of the Bible's accuracy. You know, when you look at other religious literature, let's say, for example, other ancient Near Eastern accounts, right? What makes the Bible so unique and so different than some of the other accounts from other cultures?
That's a really good question. You know, we have an Institute of Archaeology at a Christian university where I teach, and it's focusing on biblical archaeology. And you normally wouldn't have, I mean, where else would you have that? You know, the Bible lends itself to that because the Bible is actually a book that's constituted in history, or a series of 66 books that are constituted in history. It talks about a God who acts in human history. And in that sense, God allows himself to somehow be tested as well, because we can go back into that history and check all these places, all these geographical locations where God is working with his people and figure out what was going on at that time. You know, archaeologists have now, we've talked about the discovery of the name of David, but we've discovered about 120 names of individuals that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Some of them are famous kings like Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib. Others are people that are mentioned in one verse just in passing. And that confirms the historicity and the authenticity of what we are reading when we read these stories.
You know, I grew up in the Hindu culture, and in Hinduism, there are many, obviously, God-fearing Hindus and stuff, but, you know, the literature is a lot of myths and stories.
Exactly.
But many of these don't have archaeological confirmations. It sounds like the Bible is definitely a real book describing real people in real locations.
Exactly.
Who had real experiences with a very real God.
Exactly. And in Hinduism and many of these Eastern religions, it's more ephemeral. They're ideas, philosophies, that kind of thing. This is something that's rooted in everyday life. This is rooted in history. And it makes, God is he's a God who interacts in human history, interacts in our lives. And so that is something that is very, very unique and really makes the Bible unique when compared to all these other major religions out there. You're not going to find an Institute of Hindu Archaeology or Buddhist archaeology or Taoist archaeology because it doesn't lend itself to that kind of investigation.
That's incredible. Just more evidence for why we can trust the scriptures.
That's right.
If we can trust what the Bible is saying about David, we can trust what the Bible is saying about you know, the history of Israel. We can trust what it tells us about Jesus.
That's right.
And the words of Jesus.
And that makes the Bible also unique. That's the second thing that makes the Bible unique. It was constituted in history, and 30% of the Bible is prophecy. No other religion has that. No other religious sacred work has that. 30% prophecy. And there are about 350 of those prophecies in the Old Testament that point towards the Messiah, and specifically point towards the fulfillment that Jesus makes. And part of that, of course, is David, but everything else that moves along with that. So those two things allow us, again, to go back and test the scriptures and to see whether these things are so.
Dr. Halls, I can see why you're so excited about archaeology. It's contagious and gets me really excited about archaeology.
That's
Wonderful.
right.
Any other questions? Right over there.
You said earlier that it was only in the Bible that you would find prophecy and facts, but couldn't we find that also in the Quran and the Torah, since they were also made by God?
Even in ancient societies, there were elements of prophecy. They didn't quite operate the same way that prophecy operates in the Bible, in the sense that, you know, even in spiritualistic forms, you know, you can go to a soothsayer, or you can go to someone to try to see what the future holds. We know that Saul did that, King Saul did that in the Bible as well. This is not something that is accepted in the Bible, but I'm just saying, you don't have long-range prophecy in the same way in many of these sources. Now, you mentioned the Torah. The Torah is part of the Bible. It's the first 5 books of the Bible, so you definitely have it there. There's no question about it. The first prophecy in Scripture is Genesis 3:15, which is a prediction about the Messiah crushing the serpent's head. So that certainly is there, and so you'll find that, and you'll find prophecies relating to Abraham and his descendants, which is found in Genesis 12 and 15, and that's the foundation. Genesis is the foundation for the rest of Scripture. But the Quran doesn't really have prophecy in the same way. When you read the Quran, it's more of the revelation that, you know, Muhammad received from Allah, and It's much more esoteric. It's just to give you an example, if you were to take the Bible and add up all the place names, cities, rivers, countries, places where these stories took place, and you do the same with the entire Quran, okay? You do the same thing there. By the time you get to Genesis 10, you have used up all the number of place names that the entire Quran has. So there's definitely a difference in terms of history, because they weren't concerned about the God who interacts in history in the same way in the Quran as we have in the Bible. And for that reason, because the Bible teaches a linear view of history and a forward-looking view of history, you also have a God that can predict the future as well as relate to us what happened in the past. And so he's the God of the past, he's the God of the present, and he's the God of the future. And that's a huge element that we find in Scripture.
That's right. And it sounds like, when you read the Bible too, like you see plenty of examples where God is predicting something that took place, and we can see from history it took place, and it gives us confidence. Wait a minute.
That's right.
What he said in the past took place. We can trust him for what he says for us in the future.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Right over there.
If the Jews have direct access to history and these findings, and they've been authenticated, then what makes it so hard for them to accept the existence of Jesus Christ?
Oh, that's a loaded question, and one that's very difficult to answer, because every person that is part of that group of people would have to give different answers maybe for that. I think if we go back historically and look at the New Testament, we already see some evidence of that there. We see the wise men coming from the east and asking, where is this king to be born? They were following the star, and they come to King Herod. And what does King Herod do? He calls the priests, he calls the scholars, the Jewish rabbinical scholars, and the Jewish scholars, and he says, what do the prophecies say? And what did they answer? Bethlehem of Ephratah. They pointed back to Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And so that's where they went. So yes, they knew, but they were expecting something very, very different. And there's just so much history that has gone on over the centuries between Christians and between Jews. It makes it very difficult in many ways. We think of the Holocaust. We'll talk about that maybe in another program. We think about some of these difficult things they experience. There's really a divide between Christianity and Judaism, just from that cultural kind of thing. We share so much, and yet there's a divide there. And yet we have a huge growing number of Messianic Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah, who have accepted the New Testament, and still identify with their Jewish roots. And I see them when I travel to Israel. I meet with them. Some of them are actually scholars as well, and they're openly professing their belief in Jesus Christ. So I think when you really carefully study the evidence and study the evidence for yourself, people are coming to that realization, even in their Jewish tradition. And of course, we have to understand the first apostles, the first disciples of Jesus, they initially saw themselves as true Jews who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And the concept of Christianity was something that came a little bit later in time as that movement continued to grow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassel. This has been an exciting journey into biblical archaeology. It's fascinating, and I'm excited for what the future holds in regards to the things you're going to share with us in the future. So,
thank you.
This whole discussion has been sending shivers down my spine. Biblical archaeology provides yet more evidence that if what the Bible had to say was true about King David and the various cities mentioned in the Bible, then what it has to say about God must also be true. And that has a whole lot of implications for our lives, how we view ourselves, each other, and our destiny, and whether truly or not we can have hope at night. I hope you'll join me in living your life in the joyful reality of the Bible and the God it declares. Thanks again for joining us today. We'll see you next week at Hope at Night.